have you ever heard a story from history and thought, no way that actually happened? Well, get ready, because today we're diving into some of the most bizarre, unbelievable events in history that are 100% real. These are stories so strange that if they were in a movie, you'd probably roll your eyes. But the truth is even weirder than fiction. Let's start with a story from the 18th century that sounds like something out of a comic book. The dancing plague of 1518 in Strasbourg, which is now modern-day France. In the middle of July, a woman named Frau Troffea started dancing uncontrollably in the streets. And we're not talking about just a few minutes of a quirky dance. She danced for days on end. Soon, dozens of people joined her, caught in what seems like a bizarre collective madness. For weeks, entire groups of townspeople danced non-stop, some reportedly until they collapsed or even died from heart attacks, strokes, or sheer exhaustion. Scientists and historians still debate what caused this phenomenon, with theories ranging from mass hysteria to food poisoning from a toxic mold. But one thing is certain, this wasn't a rumor. It happened, and it's recorded in official city records. Now, let's jump across the ocean to the United States, where history can sometimes be just as strange. In 1835, during Andrew Jackson's presidency, the U.S. experienced the first major eclipse of the moon panic. Newspapers reported that a lunar eclipse was going to occur, and a wave of fear swept through parts of the country. People genuinely believed the world was ending, or at least that the moon's darkening was a divine warning. Markets froze, businesses closed, and in some towns, people stayed awake all night praying and performing rituals to protect themselves. While it may seem silly to us today, back then, the combination of superstition, limited scientific understanding, and sensationalist reporting created real chaos. History is filled with moments when public fears spiraled over events that seemed trivial to modernize, but at the time, they were taken deadly seriously. And just when you think things couldn't get any stranger, consider the story of the Great Emu War of 1932 in Australia. Yes, you heard that right, a war against birds. After World War I, Australian farmers were struggling with emus destroying their crops in Western Australia. The military stepped in, armed with machine guns to try to reduce the population. But here's the twist. The emus won. The birds proved too fast and too clever, evading soldiers and continuing to wreak havoc on farmland. In the end, the government had to abandon the effort, and the war became a source of national embarrassment. It sounds like a joke, but it's an official part of Australian history, and it demonstrates just how unpredictable and absurd real events can be. From mysterious epidemics to lunar panic and battles with flightless birds, history is filled with moments that sound fake but are shockingly true. And this is just the beginning. Wait until we get to events that involve accidental explosions, strange political decisions, and incredible coincidences that seemed ripped straight from a movie script. Moving forward, let's travel to the 17th century, to one of the most bizarre episodes of political history, the Cadaver Synod of 897 in Rome. Imagine a trial, but the accused is dead. Pope Stephen VI had the corpse of his predecessor, Pope Formosus, exhumed, dressed in papal robes, and put on trial. The corpse was propped up on a throne, and Stephen VI had a deacon speak on behalf of the dead pope. Charges were brought against Formosus for supposedly violating church laws and committing acts that disqualified him from the papacy. Unsurprisingly, the corpse was found guilty, and as a result, all of Formosus's acts as pope were annulled. Historians suggest this macabre spectacle was fueled by political rivalries within the church, but the absurdity of judging a dead man in a court of law is something that sounds like a dark comedy rather than actual history, yet it's well documented, proving that truth can be far stranger than fiction. Jumping continents again, we land in the frozen expanses of Antarctica during the early 20th century. In 1911, explorer Robert Falcon Scott set out on an expedition to be the first to reach the South Pole. What makes this story so unbelievable is not just the harsh conditions, they were already unimaginable, but the shocking twist. Scott and his team made it to the pole, only to find that a rival team led by Roald Amundsen had beaten them by over a month. But the nightmare didn't end there. On the grueling journey back, Scott and his men faced blizzards, frostbite, and dwindling supplies, ultimately dying just miles from safety. What's almost surreal is the sheer combination of ambition, bravery, and tragic timing. It's hard to believe that in the same era when people were inventing automobiles and airplanes, humans were still engaged in such deadly, almost cinematic quests in the icy unknown. And history keeps piling on the weird. Take the story of the London beer flood of 1814. A massive vat of beer at the Mew & Company brewery ruptured, releasing over 323,000 gallons of beer into the streets of London. The wave of beer demolished houses houses, swept people away, and tragically killed at least 8 people. Imagine the chaos, a literal tidal wave of beer flooding a neighborhood. Today, we'd probably see it as a viral video waiting to happen, but for the people who lived it, it was a terrifying disaster. This isn't an exaggeration or a story told for laughs. It's recorded in newspapers and official accounts from the time. Somehow, the combination of industrial negligence and sheer scale turned a simple beverage into a deadly force of nature. These events show that reality often trumps imagination. From political farces involving corpses to deadly explorations and catastrophic beer floods, the world has a long history of episodes so strange that they silence our sense of what could possibly be true. And what's remarkable is that despite the absurdity, each story has a serious context and real impact. People died, laws were broken, and history was irrevocably shaped. The line between fiction and fact often blurs when we look at the past closely, revealing just how wild the human story really is. Now, let's turn to a story from the early 20th century that sounds like it belongs in a science fiction novel. The Great Molasses Flood of 1919 in Boston. In January of that year, a massive tank holding over 2 million gallons of molasses burst, sending a sticky wave through the streets at an estimated 35 miles per hour. Buildings were flattened, streets were covered in the thick, sweet substance, and people and horses were trapped in the molasses, struggling to escape. At least 21 people died, and around 150 were injured. Rescue efforts were slowed because the molasses was so viscous, making movement almost impossible. Imagine walking outside and suddenly being confronted by a tsunami of syrupy goo destroying everything in its path. Sounds absurd, right? Yet photographs from the event and newspaper reports document this disaster in grisly detail, proving that truth can be far stranger than any fictional flood. Let's hop over to Asia for another unbelievable episode. The Siege of Cawnpur during the Indian Rebellion of 1857. British soldiers and civilians were trapped in a building while facing an overwhelming force. What makes this episode shocking is not just the scale of the conflict, but the horrific psychological and strategic twists involved. There were stories of betrayal, desperate last stands, and a level of brutality that seems almost surreal when compared to the way history is often taught. While war itself can be grim, certain actions during the siege, like allies turning against one another and civilians caught in impossible situations, make this chapter of history read more like a dark thriller than actual events that occurred in real life. And if you think that's strange, consider the tale of Operation Paul Bunyan in 1976. This was a military operation so bizarre that it sounds like a scene from a war comedy. In the Korean demilitarized zone, a single tree blocked visibility between United Nations and North Korean forces. Instead of negotiating, the US and South Korea sent a heavily armed team to cut down the tree, backed by hundreds of troops, attack helicopters, and artillery. The operation was planned with such precision and force that it was more like preparing for a full-scale battle, even though the mission was just to remove a tree. North Korean soldiers watched in stunned silence, but the operation was executed without a single shot fired. It's almost impossible to believe that a military conflict could revolve around something as mundane as a tree, yet this truly happened, highlighting the absurdity that sometimes accompanies high-stakes politics. These examples show a pattern. History is packed with moments so strange they almost feel fictional, from sticky molasses flooding city streets to terrifying sieges and militarized landscaping. Real events often read like wild, unbelievable stories. The world has a way of creating circumstances that seem almost engineered for shock value, but they were very real, with real consequences for the people involved. And as we dive even deeper into the history books, you'll discover even stranger tales, moments that sound too outlandish to be true, but are documented beyond any doubt. Next, let's travel to the 19th century, where truth often outpaced imagination in the most bizarre ways. In 1838, an American woman named Margaret Garner made history in an event that sounds almost too tragic and unbelievable to be true. While attempting to escape slavery in Kentucky, she was caught by authorities, and in a desperate act to protect her children from returning to bondage, she tried to kill them. What makes this story particularly shocking is how it highlights both the horror of slavery and the extreme measures people were forced into. The story was so extreme and tragic that it inspired novels and later films, but it is not fiction. It happened, and its details were documented in court records and newspapers of the time. Sometimes, reality is far crueler and more surreal than anything an author could imagine, and Margaret Garner's story history is one of the clearest examples. Then there's the story of the Tanganyika Laughter Epidemic of 1962 in modern-day Tanzania. This all started in a girls' boarding school where a single student began laughing uncontrollably. Soon, the laughter spread to dozens of students, causing so much disruption that the school had to close. But it didn't stop there. The epidemic spread through nearby villages, affecting hundreds of people over several months. Entire communities were paralyzed with uncontrollable laughter. Schools shut down and workplaces were abandoned. Doctors and psychologists studied the phenomenon, attributing it to mass hysteria triggered by stress and social pressures. The idea that laughter could infect people to the point of shutting down towns seems absurd, almost cartoonish, yet it is a verified historical event documented in academic studies of mass psychogenic illness. And then history delivers one more story that seems straight out of a slapstick comedy: the phantom time hypothesis, an idea proposed in the 1990s by a German historian that claims around 300 years of history, specifically between 614 and 911, never actually happened. According to this theory, rulers and chroniclers fabricated events to make it appear as though they were living in the year 1000. While the hypothesis itself is widely rejected by mainstream historians, it's not a joke that someone seriously argued it, presenting an entire phantom era of history that supposedly didn't exist. The fact that this was even proposed as a plausible theory highlights how strange human interpretations of history can be, and how reality sometimes borders on the unbelievable. From desperate acts of courage and horror to uncontrollable laughter sweeping entire towns to historians questioning entire centuries, history constantly reminds us that truth can be far stranger than fiction. These events push the boundaries of what we consider possible and make you wonder, if these things really happened, what else lies hidden in the dusty corners of history books waiting to shock us? And as we move into our next set of stories, the absurdity only grows. Events so wild, so unexpected, they'll make you question whether reality is just too strange for words.
To wrap up, let's explore some of the most jaw-dropping events in history. Ones that sound so impossible you'd assume they were made up, yet every detail is real. Take the story of the Battle of Los Angeles in 1942. During World War II, just months after the attack on Pearl Harbor, anti-aircraft guns in Los Angeles fired into the night sky, convinced the city was under attack by Japanese aircraft. Thousands of shells were fired over the city, creating a chaos of explosions and panic. But here's the twist. There were no enemy planes. It turned out that the panic had been triggered by a false alarm, possibly caused by weather balloons or nerves. But the city's response caused more destruction than any enemy could have. People were killed, property was damaged, and the event went down in history as one of the strangest military scares ever recorded. The sheer absurdity of a full-scale anti-aircraft assault on invisible attackers proves that reality often outshines fiction. Then there's the story of the Great Stink in London, 1858. The Thames River was so clogged with untreated human waste and industrial runoff that the stench became unbearable, literally stopping Parliament from functioning. Members of Parliament were said to be gagging during sessions, and the city scrambled to address the problem, leading to the construction of one of the first modern sewage systems. The idea that a city's government could be disrupted simply by the smell of its own river sounds ridiculous, but it's historically accurate and demonstrates how environmental crises have shaped history in ways that feel almost cartoonish. And finally, consider the phenomenon of the exploding whale in Oregon, 1970. A dead whale washed ashore, and authorities decided to dispose of it using dynamite. They assumed the whale would blow up in manageable pieces, but instead, the explosion sent massive chunks of whale blubber flying onto cars, buildings, and spectators. The resulting chaos was so extreme that people had to dodge flying pieces of whale for safety. This story sounds like something from a slapstick comedy sketch, yet footage and news reports from the time confirm it. It's a perfect example of real-life events surpassing any imagination. History is full of moments that defy belief, from dancing plagues, floods of beer and molasses, and wars against birds, to corpses on trial, mass hysteria, and explosive whales. The past repeatedly reminds us that truth is often stranger than fiction. These events make us laugh, gasp, and shake our heads, but most importantly, they remind us that reality has a sense of humor, drama, and unpredictability that no writer could ever fully invent. So, the next time you hear a story that sounds too crazy to be true, remember, history has already written stranger tales, and sometimes the truth really is wilder than fiction. And if you think that's the end of the strange, just wait. History has a way of surprising us with even more absurd events. Take the story of the War of the Stray Dog in 1925 between Greece and Bulgaria. It all started when a Greek soldier's dog ran across the border into Bulgaria, leading to the soldier crossing the border to retrieve it. A Bulgarian shot the soldier, and within days the two countries were exchanging artillery fire. What began with a dog escalated into a full-scale, albeit short, military conflict. It sounds like a plot twist from a comedy film, but it's a documented event in international history. Then there's the tale of Timothy Dexter, an eccentric American businessman in the 18th century. Dexter was so bizarrely wealthy that he literally burned a perfectly good shipment of cash to make a statement about his disdain for critics. He also published a book with no punctuation that somehow became a bestseller. His life was a mixture of audacity, luck, and absurdity, proving that some historical figures were practically living caricatures. Every time we read about him, it feels less like history and more like a cartoon come to life. And finally, we can't forget the story of the Boston Molasses Flood's distant cousin, the Great Parisian Cat Massacre of the 1730s. Apprentices in Paris, frustrated with their working conditions, allegedly killed cats owned by wealthy citizens as a form of protest. While it sounds horrifying and unbelievable, historians confirm that these acts of rebellion actually took place, reflecting both the absurd and dark ways social tensions manifested in history. The event seems almost fictional, but it reveals how human behavior can sometimes be stranger than the wildest stories we invent. These events, and countless others like them, show us that history isn't just a series of dates and facts. It's a collection of human experiences so unpredictable, so surreal, that they often defy belief. From wars started over dogs to business people burning money for fun, the past is filled with stories that make us laugh, gasp, and question reality itself. So, the next time someone tells you a story that seems too crazy to be true, remember, the world has already written far stranger tales, and sometimes the truth really is wilder than fiction.